This is the Classical Ideas Podcast. Welcome to the Classical Ideas Podcast. November is Native American Heritage Month in the United States. In episode 19, published in early November 2017, I spoke with Dr. Dennis Kelly from the University of Missouri Religious Studies Department about how to think about the purpose and goals of indigenous spiritual traditions of North America. Dr. Kelly eloquently speaks about the diverse range of beliefs and practices of the North American continent's indigenous traditions in concise and clear ways in that episode. Today's episode with artist and Pyramid Lake Paiute Indigenous man Gregg Deal is a complimentary episode to Dr. Kelly's in many ways because it goes deeper into the history of indigenous North American experiences with the colonization and settling of North America by Europeans. Not only do we discuss the very founding and the quote-unquote discovery of North America, but over our roughly 1 hour discussion, we dissect the direct results of that European landing through events like Wounded Knee, the Indian Removal Act, the American Indian Movement, and into modern discussions about representation of Native Americans, education about our nation's history, issues surrounding indigenous people as caricature mascots on football helmets, baseball jerseys, and painted on the walls of America's school gymnasiums. Gregg is an incredibly generous fellow. We had a hilarious series of planning and logistical circumstances which culminated in our meeting at his hotel at 9:30 on a Monday night, and we conducted this interview underneath 3 original Salvador Dali pieces, which can be seen on the Classical Ideas Twitter feed. It was a deep dive on issues every one of us needs to know much more about. Every single American needs to participate in this cultural discussion, which could hopefully lead to a serious evaluation of the history of our nation and our path forward toward righting the wrongs and correct the uninformed and false narrative of the history of manifest destiny. Gregg Deal is on the front lines of this discussion. You may have seen him on The Daily Show at one time. I highly recommend you check out his artwork at greggdeal.com, and Gregg is spelled with 2 G's on the end. Follow him on Twitter at Gregg Deal, on Instagram at Gregg Deal, and check out his 14 posted short films on Vimeo. In his biography, Gregg introduces himself by saying, "I'm an artist, a vandal, a dad, a husband, and indigenous Pyramid Lake Paiute." Just a little heads up, Gregg does tell stories from his childhood that include racial slurs he's experienced. He doesn't hold back on these, nor did I ask him to. Without further ado, I bring you Gregg Deal. Welcome to the Classical Ideas Podcast. I am here tonight with artist Gregg Deal. Gregg, thanks for coming on the Classical Ideas Podcast.
Thanks for having me.
So I'm curious if you could just kind of talk about your day. I know you've been at the University of Missouri all day for Native Heritage Month events. Could you kind of talk about what you've been doing today?
Yeah, so I was at a class, experimental film class, I believe is what it was. Discussing my use of film within my work. I'm a fine artist, so I do mostly, anything from paintings to murals to performance art to installation work, spoken word, you name it. But there's an element of film that I use in that, so I talked about that with some students. And did an interview with a graduate student this morning, and then ultimately gave a keynote that included The Last American Indian on Earth, my performance piece and film, and then talked about work and talked about some social issues and things on campus. So that was pretty much the day.
They've had a really amazing calendar of events going on all month, and I saw you and I reached out to you a couple weeks ago, and I'm really glad that we can make this work tonight. So can you kind of go ahead and introduce yourself for the audience and maybe talk a little bit about your work?
Yeah. So my name is Gregg Deal. I'm a member of the Pyramid Lake Paiute Tribe. I am an artist, and I'm also a husband and a father. I like to include those things because that is still a big part of my identity. And
Me too.
I mean, at the end of the day, no matter what I'm doing, what I'm saying, I'm still at home, elbow deep in kid crap, changing diapers.
Absolutely.
So it's real as it can be. I'm an Indigenous artist. I mean, I say I'm an artist that just happens to be Indigenous. I work on mediums that are varying, and the subject is usually social and political and cultural, a lot with Indigenous identity, historical consideration, various social issues that sort of plague the everyday Indigenous existence, and the way in which we kind of navigate those spaces. I use a lot of humor in my work to sort of illustrate where the problems are, but also, which creates makes it a little more approachable, a little more digestible. But at the same time, I don't pull punches from a lot of the social issues and the political issues that we face. And man, I'm just an artist. That's what I do all day, every day, and I love it.
One of the things that I've noticed as I've looked at your art for the last couple of days is how approachable you seem. Like even when you're doing like an installation somewhere, like when you're outside in Denver, surrounded by like a little barricade saying "Don't feed the stereotype."
Yeah.
And some of the conversations that you had with people in your film, The Last American Indian on Earth, they were kind of interesting, and you were just so approachable to people who came up to you.
There's a couple of, so as a frame of reference, The Last American Indian on Earth is a performance piece where I essentially embody the stereotype. And in embodying the stereotype, I'm wearing a headdress and I'm wearing, a ribbon shirt and breechcloth, and I look like what you would expect. And it has to be noted that everything I'm wearing is fake, that it's actually not real. They're made in China, made in Mexico. And so that's the way in which I'm embodying the stereotype. But as a Native person, I change the definition of what you're looking at by virtue of who I am. And so with the headdress on, I'm about 6'4", and with the headdress on, it makes me over 7 feet tall. And I don't know if I'm approachable or not. I mean, I have face makeup, and I usually wear sunglasses everywhere I go because that gives me an element of control. But people, Americans in general are curious, and they will come at you and they will, demand to know what is happening. And my role in there is as a performance piece, is to simply exist in the space. So the performance really ends up kind of being the people that are interacting with me, and I can't inhibit them. I need to let them talk and let them kind of do what they do. And I document all of that. Now I have to point out, this was in 2013 to 2014. I did it for a year. So obviously it's 2017. I don't do it anymore.
Sure.
So don't be scared to approach me. But yeah, I mean, there is an element of approachability. And I think Americans are so enamored with this image of, what they perceive to be Indigenous, that they come into it a number of different ways, from just genuine curiosity to outright, racist statements. And that is just the nature of the American Indian in the United States, and particularly in relation to American culture.
So let's dig into what's going on right now. So you were here in Columbia, Missouri as a part of the Native American Heritage Month events at the University of Missouri. Mm-hmm. So what are your thoughts on Native American Heritage Month? Like, what are the pros and cons to something like this?
I think I'll list the cons first. One of the biggest cons is that Native American Heritage Month has been around for a long time. And despite the fact that it's been around for a long time, it's not highly celebrated or acknowledged, not in the same way that Black History Month is sort of acknowledged and celebrated. And because the Black History Month very quickly became part of school curriculums, and in acknowledging during the course of that month different figures who have been a part of Black history and contributed. we're not really given the same courtesy. Whenever natives are talked about, we're often talked about as this relic that lived in the past. And, you might hear about Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse and Geronimo and, all these people. But you don't ever hear about contemporary natives. You don't hear about the first native that went to space. You don't hear about any of these things that are modern contributions. And so there's no context in terms of how Native American Heritage Month is used, and it's not highly celebrated the way that Black History Month is celebrated. And I think a lot of that has to do with just an American understanding of Indigenous people, particularly modern Indigenous people. I think those are the cons. The pros is that it is another thing that allows for opportunity to talk about those things. So people heard me speak tonight that heard me say things that they might not ever hear in any other context. And I think that's a positive. But I think we have to be careful, especially in this country. Oftentimes when these types of events happen, heritage months or acknowledgement or those things, they end up sort of being a box that's checked off. And when you check off a box, it's like, well, we're done with that. We don't have to go back to it. Now they can't say anything. And it eliminates the process of reconciliation, particularly in terms of our history. Looking at American history and the way that American history has interacted with Indigenous people, there's some heavy reconciliation that needs to happen there. And that's not going to happen by checking off a box because we have a Native American Heritage Month. But that interaction, like the interaction I got to have today on campus and that I've done all month since Columbus Day, is an important part of representation and talking and dialogue and the understanding of Indigenous existence in America. I think that's important.
So I'm curious about your own tribal affiliation. So who are the Pyramid Lake Paiute Tribe?
So the Pyramid Lake Paiute Tribe, we're out in the Great Basin area. We're about 30 miles north of Reno. We're one of several different bands of Paiute that are right on the California and Nevada border. We go all the way up into Oregon. We're related to Western Shoshone. The languages are a lot the same, and we're sort of the last group of natives that came into contact with colonialism and with, the gold rush and sort of the manifest destiny rush to the West before people got to California. And Californian natives got it really, really bad as far as the way that they were treated and killed. And we were kind of in this strange little place of being native, and we had problems, and we were part of different wars and treaties and things like that. But I think the California natives got it so much worse in terms of the timeline of people moving out west. Paiute's a made-up word. It doesn't really mean anything. We call ourselves Numu. We are identified through different diets. So there's a fish in our lake that's called the Kiwi, and so we're considered to be the Kiwi eaters. If you go up to Walker River, which is just a little ways of Walker River Paiutes, they're the trout eaters. And so we have this sort of identification through diet, which I think is really cool and interesting, and kind of tied in also to language and stories and that kind of thing. But I didn't grow up on a reservation. My mom was born out there, and I grew up in Utah.
So you kind of have a unique mix of cultural experiences. What's it like to be Native growing up in a conservative white state like Utah?
Not easy. So I grew up in Park City, which is a ski resort town. There's 3 major ski resorts there. The Sundance Film Festival is up there in January. A lot of famous people come through there. And so it has all the signs and sort of symbols of, a large city, but it's not. My graduating class was 100 kids. We're a small town. It was mostly white kids. My sister and I And I can think of maybe 2 other people, maybe 3 other people that were spread throughout the different classes that were brown. I think there was 1 black kid. And so there was no diversity. And in the 80s and into the 90s, that's, the eras that I grew up in, we didn't really have it good. It was a small town and nobody knew how to deal with us. I'm half native, I'm half white, but I look native. And, my poor father always looked like the stepdad that, came in and saved the nice minority family. Because my sister and I and my mom, were all brown. But it became very real. I mean, the first racial slur I ever heard was in kindergarten. And it was pointed at me, and I was called a prairie nigger, so that's my experience. That's some heavy, heavy stuff. And Utah's a very white place. And, while there's nothing wrong with that, the limitations that come with that weigh heavily upon kids that are perceived as an other, or that come from marginalized groups, or that are people of color, that doesn't allow for much room to move around or acceptance. And that was a very real thing for me growing up. I can't speak to it now. I don't know how it is now. I have only been back a couple times since I left when I was pretty young. But it was difficult growing up. It was just difficult growing up there.
And then I know when you were in our conversations before this, I know that you mentioned that you also converted to LDS, Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I know that there's potentially a distrust in forms of Christianity in indigenous communities. How does that LDS identity play into your life today?
Well, so, I grew up a preacher's kid. My father was more or less a pastor, and things got a little discombobulated probably about 8th grade. So most of high school, we didn't have, religion wasn't a big thing. And my elders have always said that it's important for us to belong to a church or to have a religion, because it helps us keep in contact with things of the spirit, so that when we're doing ceremony or when we're doing the things that we're supposed to be doing, that we have a frame of reference on what it means to communicate with the Creator. And so for me, that was the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. When I was 18, it spoke to me. It made sense to me. I joined the church. I went on a mission, and when I came home, I took some time off. Missions are really hard, and probably even harder when you're brown and a predominantly, in America, it's predominantly white. And I had some difficulties there. Absolutely had some difficulties there. But it keeps me on the straight and narrow, it keeps me away from things that, there's a standard that's set. I don't drink. I don't do drugs. I don't smoke. I don't do all of the things that, a lot of people do that's fairly accepted in places. But as an Indigenous person, I think that's actually a really important thing to have, because we're susceptible to those things, to those substances. And to me, it's also about having a grounding. I have a belief system that helps keep me grounded. I have a family. That was one of the big things I really wanted. I wanted just like a nice family. When my father kicked me out when I was 17, I was on my butt and I didn't have anything. And so it gave me something to anchor myself to. It gave me things to shoot for. There's a standard of, that you should go to school and you should strive to have, a family in a specific context. And I've been able to do all of those things in spite of the situation that I was in. I dropped out of high school when I was 17 because I had to move out. I didn't have anything. I love my parents. But when I was 17 years old, it was not cool, and we didn't get along. And so for me to be able to have a better sense of those things like family and to execute that in my own life, I've got 5 kids and I've been married for 18 years, happily married for 18 years, and I love it. I wouldn't change it for anything. We go to church every Sunday. That's a big part of the balance that takes place in our home, and that I can talk to my kids about the things of the Spirit. They have reference to that when it comes to our Indigenous identity as well. I see those things as being very connected. And so for me, particularly coming from, not totally troubled, but I would say troubled, as a kid, it offered me balance that I couldn't find anywhere else.
I think so many things that you just said would be so relatable to just about anybody listening to this, like especially thinking back to those difficult teenage years. I'm a high school teacher, and every day I look at the faces of teenagers in the hallways of a 1,500 student high school, and I say to my students all the time, I was like, listen, I wouldn't go back to being your age for $1 million. Like, you're in one of the hardest times of your life. And so it's, I'm always just curious to hear people's stories on how they got through that. So thanks for telling me your story.
Yeah.
So let's kind of dive into your art a little bit. So tell me a little bit about the premise for one of your current projects, The Last American Indian on Earth, and what were you seeking to discover and learn about the country as you did the project and made the film?
So this was my first performance piece. I started in April 2013, and I did it for a year. I think I mentioned the premise of it before, that I was sort of carrying this stereotype. My goal was not to discover anything. My goal was to exploit. It was about exploiting a reaction that I already knew would happen. I worked at the National Museum of American Indians the inaugural year that it opened. It opened in September 2004 on the National Mall. It's the Indian Museum. And I worked with a group of people that were on the ground floor dealing with the public. And from September 2004 to, I believe it was April 2005, 1 million people had been through those doors. That's how busy it was. And the interesting thing about it, and I think it was shocking to all of us because most all of us were just out of college, was the way that people would treat us. I mean, there would be people who were awesome, and then there were people that were just awful. And then there were people in the middle that were maybe just ignorant and saying horrible things, but not realizing they're saying horrible things. But we would hear in a week what most natives would hear in their lifetime, as far as the level of insensitive and inappropriate comments that are based on race and perception and misconception. And because of that experience, which was very difficult, I knew that The Last American Indian on Earth would work, that my existence with this outfit would simply exist in space, and people would approach it and treat it and say things and do things, and that I would document the way in which people would react and interact with me. I documented it through film, and I documented it through photograph. And so I was exploiting the very thing that people tell us, Native people, that we're being too sensitive. I'm sure they didn't mean it. They're just, you're being too sensitive, don't act like such a victim. Don't do all these things. And I now have a film that proves that I'm not too sensitive, and that there's an actual problem with the way that Americans perceive Indigenous people and ultimately interact with Indigenous people, which is not necessarily Americans' fault. The education system that is offered in terms of Native people is so poor and so inept that there's simply no frame of reference on who they're talking to, what they're talking to. I mean, there are people in this country that believe that Native Americans are dead, that they no longer exist. And there's people in this country that believe that the Indians that do exist still live in teepees or hogans or, whatever lean-to, and that the only Indians that are out there have, feathers and headdresses and all of these things that aren't real. And so I was looking to exploit that and sort of illustrate the point. And I think it was successful in that respect.
There were so many really kind of amazing interactions in that film. There was one interaction where a gentleman was on a sidewalk, and I think that you approached him because he was making some kind of like whooping noises or something like that. And you approached him and said, well, how do you find that? Do you find it to be offensive?
Yeah.
And you also talked to another woman who said to you, you don't look any different than any other American.
Yeah.
And then insinuated that maybe it would be difficult for you to some reason to relate to potentially the white half of your family.
Yeah.
As opposed to the native half of your family. And so what do you make of this type of question? I mean, do you think that she was merely trying to learn more? Like, do you think that some buried deep down she was trying to come at it from a good place of learning? Or is she falling guilty to like of her own question that if someone has a different cultural background in some way, they, meaning you, are unrelatable and therefore like some kind of like amusing spectacle?
Yeah. So most of the stuff, it requires some pretty serious context. You got to go back pretty far. And so when you go back far enough and, you know, in this country where we live, there's these sort of mantras that exist, that this is land of the free, home of the brave, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of assembly, freedom to do all the things that we want to do. And the American dream ties into that. Native Americans were never part of the American dream ever. And in not being part of the American dream, I mean, you have to look at, was it the Declaration of Independence, where it talks about being free to pursue, you know, life, liberty, and or whatever, in the pursuit of happiness, right? That all men are created equal. But at the time that was proclaimed, there were slaves. And in the Declaration of Independence, it refers to Native people as merciless savages. So are they talking about freedom for all mankind, or is their viewpoint of mankind simply being white Europeans that come here specifically to find opportunity and to create a new life? And I just cannot believe that it is anything other than that. And if you look at the way that history's taught, particularly in high school, that, you know, this is the example I always use. I'm going to pick on you for a second.
No, go for it.
All right, so who discovered America? I'm using air quotes.
Allegedly, 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue.
Right. And what were the name of the ships that he was on?
The Nina, the Pinta, the Santa Maria.
Right. Everybody knows this.
Yeah.
What's the name of the tribes, the groups of people that he came into contact with, and what island did he land on?
It was the Arawaks, and... would it be the modern day Dominican Republic?
That's right.
Hispaniola.
Yeah.
But the only reason I know that is because I read the first chapter of People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn.
Well, and this is the thing. Like, if I were in a crowd and if I were to ask that question, usually they know all the Columbus stuff and they don't know anything else.
I feel really smart right now.
So what that boils down to is like the level of importance that is placed on Indigenous people. I'll give you another example. Who's Abraham Lincoln?
He was the president of the United States that oversaw the Civil War.
And what was he really famous for doing?
The Emancipation Proclamation and the Gettysburg Address.
What is the Emancipation Proclamation?
The freeing of the slaves.
So when he put that into place, it wasn't until the next year that was going to be implemented. So a week before it was going to be implemented, so this would be Christmas, he signed off on the largest mass hanging in American history. It was of 38 Dakota men that were being hung as a result of making an example. And originally, I think it was right around 400 people, but they whittled it down to 38. I believe it was plus 2. I think they added 2 on there as well. Have you ever heard of that before?
Never.
So the great emancipator is also responsible for signing off on the largest mass hanging in American history, where 38 plus 2 men were simultaneously hung in Minnesota. And I don't bring that up because I'm saying that Abraham Lincoln is an evil man or a good man. I bring that up because the importance of history shows you where we fall in the hierarchy of importance. That nobody knows that because it doesn't happen, it doesn't exist, and then therefore we don't exist. You can see the same thing in the you can see this. I have a whole purpose why I'm going down this tangent.
Yeah, no, it's great.
There's an island off of San Francisco that used to be a prison. Do you know what that one's called?
Alcatraz.
And when they shut it down, have you ever heard of anything that happened at Alcatraz?
Yeah, the occupation of from the American Indian movement.
So in the late 60s, for almost 2 years, Native people occupied and reclaimed Alcatraz Island. There was this arbitrary law that basically stated that if federal lands are no longer being used, they can be reclaimed by the original inhabitants. And so they occupied that space for 2 years. That's a huge occupation.
It's amazing.
Right after that happened, they put together what they called the Caravan of Broken Treaties. And they drove, starting in San Francisco, and they drove across the country to Washington, D.C., picking up natives along the way. And this was part of the American Indian movement. This was part of the civil rights movement of indigenous people. I think at that point, it was still the late 60s, maybe early 70s. And they arrive in Washington, D.C., and they take over the Department of the Interior. They have a 2-day sit-in in a government building, protesting over the Bureau of Indian Affairs and the Department of the Interior with a list of demands for President Nixon. So there's photographs of Indians standing on the roof of government buildings, which is incredible because in the age of sit-ins and things, nobody sat in on government buildings. That didn't happen. But a huge group of Indians took over a building. I bring this up, and the way that this relates back to a woman who can't seem to relate to me is that because there's no consideration in the hierarchy of importance in history, there's no context. There's no relation to me being anything other than maybe some John Wayne movie that she saw when she was a young girl. And so she can't believe that I'm a person. She can't believe that I'm a human being. And if we're never put into the context of being human beings, then we're put in the context of being an other. We are the other. We're savages. We are uncivilized. We're all these different things. And so she finds herself in a position, in a place where she's confronted with my existence. She doesn't know how to handle it. And most Americans have that problem. I mean, I had a residency at the Denver Art Museum, and I was in that space, and a gentleman said to me, he interrupted me, first off, and then he said, when I talk to you, I can't believe that I'm talking to a Native American because you talk like a white man. And in that premise, I don't think he meant anything by it. I think it just came out of his mouth, word vomit, if you will.
Sure.
But in that moment, I think he realized that not only am I articulate and do I have the ability to express the points in a smart way, but that maybe I was a little smarter than him. And that surprised him because we're told that Indians are stupid. We're told that Indians are poor, that they're sad, that they're drunk, that they're all these things. But we're never told that they're articulate and that they're intelligent and that they have a command over Western culture and a command over Western language. And so because we're never put into that context, even in like Native American Heritage Month, we're never given an opportunity to express our modern leaders that have done great things for us. Everything from the American Indian movement leaders all the way down to a woman, the first principal chief of the Cherokee Nation, Wilma Mankiller. It's the coolest name ever.
It's really amazing.
And these are our leaders. These are the people that are making change, and there's still leaders and people making change right now. And but people don't understand what the context of that is until we start, talking about the things that threaten the things that people think are most important, like, sports mascots.
So I know that everything that you just said about the way that it's taught in schools is completely true. A few years ago, I was fortunate enough to be a part of this study where we looked at all of the U.S. history standards for American history for high schools nationwide from all 50 states. And we found that somewhere between, it was 85 or 88% of the times that Native anything is mentioned in standards, it's pre-Wounded Knee. Mm-hmm. So almost every single historical mention in the U.S. history standards nationwide in all 50 states plus D.C. shows Native Americans in a pre-1895 context.
Right. I would be willing to bet that context is even to dig even deeper, that context only exists in relation to validate American history. So, when you look at something like the Thanksgiving story, mm-hmm. Native Americans only exist in the Thanksgiving story because we exist to justify and validate the Pilgrims and the Indians in this feast that was about Thanksgiving, which doesn't take into consideration the I think it's 400 Pequots that were slaughtered, men, women, and children, and that after that slaughter there was a Thanksgiving feast to celebrate the slaughter of these people. The relations that were had between the Puritans and the natives on the East Coast during that initial, contact in the Northeast of the United States was an extremely and horrific, bloody exchange that ultimately ended up in the demise of entire indigenous nations. But those Indians, in particular Squanto, and the things that he did for the Puritans, or the things that he did for the Pilgrims, were all there to validate the white Europeans that came here. When we hear about the most modern thing we hear in history is usually about Sitting Bull. And Sitting Bull is only there to validate the exchange between the native nations that were there and Manifest Destiny. And then you don't hear anything after that. There's a woman from the Northern Paiute nations. Her name is Sarah Winnemucca. She's one of only 2 statues in the rotunda in the Capitol building in Washington, D.C. And she's also the first Native woman to publish a book. And she spoke multiple languages, and she shared stories and worked as a liaison between Native nations and non-Native nations during a time when that was really, really needed. But you don't hear about that because that's in Nevada, and that's nowhere near North or South Dakota or Minnesota where the Plains Indian Wars took place. And so the people that exist within American history only exist to validate American history and not to validate their own existence for the sake of their own existence. And so even somebody like Sitting Bull, who's this incredible figure, is not given justice in how incredible he is. He's only given enough to validate those stories. Same thing with Geronimo, same thing with Crazy Horse, same thing with like in more general sense, the Cherokee Nation. I mean, President Trump just did this thing with, the Navajo Code Talkers, and he made reference to Elizabeth Warren, and he did all of this in front of in the backdrop a big painting of Andrew Jackson,
who signed the Indian Removal Act,
and was responsible for the death of hundreds, if not thousands, of Native people, because it wasn't just the Cherokee on the Trail of Tears, it was also the Choctaw, and there's a number of tribes that were affected by that act, which wasn't an act of Congress, but was done by executive order, and he basically just kind of flew off the handle and did whatever the hell he wanted, and was a well-known Indian hater. And so when you know your history, context is everything, and you begin to understand why we exist the way we exist. We exist only to validate the American dream. And if you start to talk about the truth about our existence, we begin to undermine the American dream. A good example of that is there's a Native American Religious Freedom Act that was implemented specifically to give back us our right to ceremony, our right to do all of the things that every American should have the right to do, right? Freedom of religion. Mm-hmm. That was in 1978.
Holy cow.
So in my lifetime, an act was created to reinstate the right to indigenous religion or spirituality or ceremony. And up to that point, it was illegal. So there's some good context for it.
Wow, you just dropped a whole lot of things on me that I didn't know. And that giving those speeches the other day in front of the Andrew Jackson portrait was pretty unforgivable, symbolically.
I mean, I guess. I could act with a heck of a lot of, self-righteous indignation about Donald Trump and my feelings about him. But really, I mean, do I need to act surprised? At this point, I don't think I need to act surprised. He's going to do what he's going to do.
So let's talk about some good stuff. So I'm a teacher, and I'm curious about doing better work and furthering dialogue between all Americans. That's why I have this podcast. I just love these one-on-one conversations. They're so much fun for me. So what advice can you offer, like as an artist, as an Indigenous man, as an artist who happens to be Indigenous, what kind of advice would you give to teachers who are seeking to legitimately do better work so that future generations in this country can do a better job of creating positive relationships among human beings?
I think first and foremost is finding ways to enable Indigenous voices. I think what is really important for our youth of America, is to hear Indigenous voices. You know, in my film, The Last American Indian on Earth, I talk about the young man that I was working with, who was working on his master's thesis, who was shooting video. I was the subject of his master's thesis, so he was shooting video and he was shooting film of my project. And when the project was completed, he took all of that footage that I was supposed to use to create my own film, and he made his own film without me. And he cut me out of the project, and he did a different narrative and everything else. And the problem with that is that he took away from me my story, the right I have to my Indigenous voice, because we don't hear the Indigenous voice. If you've ever seen Dances with Wolves, that's not a Native American movie. It's not a movie even really about Native Americans. It's a movie about Kevin Costner, who plays this, white, cavalry soldier who suffers in behalf of Native Americans, making the Native Americans in that group, who are the Lakota, that he's suffering in behalf of them. They are the backdrop. And so too often we don't hear Indigenous voices, whether that's through literature or art or photography or film. And I think enabling opportunities to hear those Indigenous voices makes all the difference in the world. My oldest son, his teacher reached out to me, I think it was last year or the year before. And she's like, hey, Native American Heritage Month, and I have these books, and I know you're Native, and can I send these books home with your son, and you can take a look at them and tell me what you think? And she did, and I got the books. And I read the books, and I looked up the author on the books, and I checked through them. And it was a non-Native man who heard some Native stories and decided that he really liked the stories, and decided he was going to write these books, and that he was going to illustrate these books, and he was going to share that. And those were the books that she shared. And I responded back to her as respectfully as I can, because I know people get a little, teachers especially, they don't want to be told that they're wrong, so you gotta tread lightly. And I said, these books are not written by a Native person. These stories may loosely be based on these things, but ultimately it's a non-Native person who's telling a Native story. And you have to ask the question, who gave him the right to tell these stories? Where is he coming from? Is this appropriate? Is this not appropriate? And I'm of the thought that intention really doesn't mean anything. And so I gave her a list of books that are written by Indigenous authors, that are illustrated by Indigenous people, that would do a much better service to those things. And her response to me was, well, I appreciate your opinion, but I'm just going to go ahead and read these books anyways. And then I never heard anything about it again. And that's a problem, because when you hear Indigenous stories, like, I know this might sound a little hokey to some, but here's the truth about Indigenous stories, and particularly the truth about Indigenous stories in the context of this country, because everywhere we walk in the United States is Indian land. When you tell Native stories on Native land, there's power behind that. And that power is something that can be fed to our kids in a good way, to any kid, any American kid in a good way. Because we need to honor the land that we're on. We need to honor the people that lived on this land before us, that in most cases sacrificed with their lives, unknowingly and unwillingly in a lot of cases, sacrificed their lives so that we could be here.
I know I'm going to put you on the spot with this one, but can you name drop a couple books?
Oh, gosh.
Like maybe some of those ones that you suggested to teachers?
Yeah. I had a nice list. There's a book I think it's by Sherman Alexie, and what is it called? I'll look it up while we talk. And there's a couple of other books that are like for older kids that would work. There's this writer in the 60s. His name was Vine Deloria. And Vine Deloria wrote these books with these amazing titles, like Custer Died for Your Sins. And he has a book about religion. It's called God is Red. And
I've heard of that.
Yeah, and it's interesting because it really talks about the way religion has sort of interacted with Indigenous communities. And I'm a big fan of those as well. But There's another book called and I think this is probably a little easier to digest for some people, and it's called The Inconvenient Indian. And The Inconvenient Indian is about, it's talking about this is what it says, a curious account of Native people in North America by Thomas King. And the way that he talks about indigeneity is incredible. And I would highly suggest that one. That's a good read. And then Sherman Alexie, he does some okay books. He's pretty well known for what he does, but he has a kid's book, and I'm still trying. Oh, it's called Thunderboy Jr.
Oh, yes.
And the reason why that's such a good book is because it talks about names, and names that we carry and the language that we carry, our indigenous languages, are such a huge and important point of culture and storytelling and the understanding of those stories. And so I think that's a pretty poignant book. I got that one for my kids. I love it.
So I want you to imagine a teacher, maybe a young teacher, who teaches at a school where the mascot of the school is Native. So I'd imagine that many of these teachers are incredibly uncomfortable with the mascot of their school being, like a head of somebody who is Indigenous. And I'd imagine that a lot of them are nervous to lead any kind of movement to change any long-standing mascots or anything. And I know that you're involved with the hashtag change the name, a little bit of hashtag not your mascot movements. So what kind of advice would you give to a well-meaning teacher who maybe wants to say something?
It's a precarious situation. It's precarious. Honestly, it's precarious being the only Native in the room and having that feeling. You have to identify your allies, the people that would stand with you, the people that would stand in solidarity. And in the case of a teacher who, obviously wants to keep their job, allies that are on the same wavelength, but that also don't have to lead the charge. And sometimes that charge is led by students. Sometimes it's led by their parents. Sometimes it's led by both. Because ultimately what happens when a student does those things is the student needs support from a teacher. And it's a slow process, but I think it's also a rewarding one if it's done in the right way. Creating a dialogue, first and foremost, that's what needs to happen. I've been to a lot of protests. I've been to a lot of rallies, and I'll tell you what happens most of the time at those protests and rallies is you have one group of people that are yelling at another group of people, and they're exchanging back and forth and probably saying mean things as they're doing it. And while a protest looks really good on the news and for photographs and, it's a show of force, ultimately it does not contribute to meaningful discourse or meaningful dialogue. And what it really comes down to is having a proper conversation about these things. Mascots are a really interesting thing. Oftentimes there's a dismissiveness of mascots because it's like, oh, well, you're offended. And if I say I'm offended, then the burden of responsibility is on my shoulders because I'm the one with the problem. The burden of responsibility is not up to me. The burden of responsibility is the perpetuator of that thing that's a problem. And so I'm not offended. And frankly, if I am offended, I'm okay. I'm an adult. I'm going to get over it. But that doesn't take away from you being offensive. And so that burden of responsibility is yours if you're offensive. And that doesn't change until the people who perpetuate those things take responsibility for what's happening. But at the end of the day, it's not really at all about me. It's about my kids. So I've often heard people say, well, why do you worry about mascots? There's more important things to worry about. I'm unclear with what is more important than the health and well-being of my children. Because what mascots do is they create a serious lapse in self-esteem and of self-perception among Native kids. In fact, there was a study done that shows that it creates a greater sense of self-esteem, low self-esteem, and a greater sense of disconnect and acceptance to Indigenous kids being who they are. But on the flip side of that, they also found that Native American mascots also builds up non-Native kids, particularly white kids. And so while mascots break down Native kids, it also builds up at the same time non-native kids.
Oh, wow.
And so the result of mascots is significant, and it's something that's very, very serious. I'm concerned about my kids' perception of themselves. And as a father, that's the most important thing to me. So nobody can tell me that it's not important. So I think being aware of all those things, and listen, a quick Google search will wield all of this information. It's all out there. But you have to be willing to have an open mind and an open heart, believing that these things are actually on some level true and worth looking at. That's the first step. The first step to admitting that there's a problem, or to solving a problem is admitting that there is a problem, and there's a problem.
Yeah, and we're doing something like that here in town a little bit. There's one of our schools named after Robert E. Lee right now, and there's a huge committee going on right now, and it's been in the news here in town. So, it's not easy.
It's not, and sometimes it deserves a little bit of context. The most popular mascots in our country for high schools, for virtually any schools, are animals and Indians. It's like in that context, you begin to realize that Indians are listed with animals. I mean, if you look at the Department of the Interior, the job of the Department of the Interior is national parks and forestry and Indians. When you consider that Native people actually are the most documented people in the world, that we have to know our bloodlines by the fraction in order to belong to our indigenous communities. The only things that follow a very specific and regulated pedigree in the United States are dogs and horses and Indians. And so there's some serious context to these things, and those contexts need to change. They need to be adjusted, or at the very least understood enough to be able to have a proper conversation about, things like mascots.
So you've traveled a lot around the country as an artist and as a filmmaker. What kind of positive changes do you see occurring? And then on the flip side, do you see anything regressing?
Academia is an interesting place because I think academia is trying really hard to be progressive. And I think progressive is a good thing. I think it's a good thing because it allows for conversations that maybe don't normally happen. And in consideration of spaces, there's a huge movement towards identity right now. I don't think it's a political thing. I don't think it has anything to do with being politically correct. I think it has everything to do with considering the way that people identify that helps people feel most comfortable. And so within that concept of identity, there's some good and deep conversations that come from that. Transgenders always existed, but now there's a vernacular that exists so that we can have a conversation to better understand what that means and how that experience has been through the ages. Transgender people have been around forever. They've never not been there. You can find it in Greek history. You can, find it in Roman history. It's been there for a long, long time. And I'm not saying that's right or wrong. I'm saying that there is a vernacular that exists that we can talk about how these things sort of are. And so I like seeing that. I think that that's interesting, and I think it makes room for other groups and other people. But there is a resurgence of racism and white supremacy right now. And I think it's really disturbing because it's ultimately missing... It's missing a lot of proper conversation. I don't know, when you got a bunch of white supremacists in Charlottesville screaming blood and soil, which, by the way, is the weirdest thing I've ever heard because, blood and soil comes from, Nazi Germany, and it's like ethnic Germans talking about their right to land. So when you have a bunch of ethnic white Europeans standing on American soil, saying
North America
soil, nobody finds that more ironic than an indigenous person.
Absolutely.
But that language is such a really hard and interesting thing at the same time. And I don't think there's anything wrong with being conservative. I don't think there's anything wrong with being liberal, but politically speaking. But I don't think that any of those things have anything to do with Christianity. I don't think they have anything to do with the way in which Christ taught during his ministry, and I don't think that they have to be political and to take those political concepts and say that they're somehow moral, I think is ridiculous, because Christ was not about politics. Christ was about just simply the belief in God and the path that we have to take in order to return back to him. And so right now what's happening that I think is very disturbing is this mix of politics and this mix of race politics and religion, that somehow evangelical somehow equates to this political concept that doesn't allow any room for the teachings of Christ. And that, when Christ is saying, when I knocked on, your door, did you feed me? Did you clothe me? Did you do all those things? That is about us as followers of Christ, helping people and talking to people and feeding them and clothing them and opening our doors to them and being Christ-like in our actions. And we have an entire contingent of Christians in America that believe that anybody who is foreign, particularly brown foreign from, Central America, or from a Muslim country, that those rules somehow don't apply. And I think that that's the hardest thing for me to see right now. I'm a big fan of talking. I'm a big fan of dialogue. I think that we have to talk about all these things, and I'm glad that we are talking about those things. I think that that's a progressive thing that's happening right now. And in particular with the amount of politics and things that are happening, we have to talk about those things. And it's uncomfortable to talk about race, and it's uncomfortable to talk about history in terms of race as well. But, if we're all religions, except maybe Satanists, all religions have an element of charity and love, and this idea of sustaining and supporting human beings, because we're all children of the Creator, and if we're not having a conversation and we're not having dialogue, then it doesn't help us keep on task with what our religions, whatever your religion is, requires us to do in being kind to our fellow man and our fellow women.
So, Gregg, where can people find you and your work?
I have a website. It's greggdeal.com.
2 G's, though.
2 G's, GREGGDEAL. That same word with no spaces. You'll find me on Instagram. I'm on Facebook. I'm on Twitter. I tend to share a lot of photographs of my work and my family, my kids and stuff. So there's a pretty good mix of the two. They're not separate. And
you have a Vimeo account too. I watched Last American Indian on Earth on Vimeo this morning.
I do. Yeah. So I've got some time lapses on there and things. I did do a Bernie Sanders mural. So for any of those conservative friends out there, I apologize. Don't get upset.
And you've got a really great T-shirt and artwork store too.
Yeah, I have a number of prints, a lot of which sort of point to one of the more popular ones right now says existence as protest. And so it's a statement of our indigenous existence being a protest to the policies that have been put forward on us. And so, there's a lot of T-shirts and prints that sort of are along those lines, talking about sort of the social and political justices that we fight for. So kind of propaganda style posters. I don't know. I like doing my posters.
So Gregg, the reason I invited you on this podcast is because this podcast is called Classical Ideas.
Yeah.
And to me, learning about indigenous culture, indigenous identity, that's about as classical as you can get for North America.
It's true. It's true. We're still here. And I think we have a lot to offer as far as perspective. We have a connection to this land. These are our homelands. This is the land of our people. We are essentially a covenanted people with the Creator, and we've been tasked with being stewards over the places that we reside, that we walk. And even though, most of our land is gone or has been parceled out by the federal government, or however you want to look at it, that still doesn't change the fact that these are our homelands. And I think if you were to listen to indigenous people in that context, I think there's a lot to offer.
This has been a real pleasure of a conversation.
Yeah, thanks for having me, man.
I am so glad that we were willing and able to fit this in, and it's been a real pleasure getting to know you.
Thanks, man. I appreciate it.
All right, thanks. The Classical Ideas podcast is written and performed by me, Greg Soden. Original music is composed and performed by Derek Strybig. His music can be found at www.wearewarmmusic.com. Thanks for listening.